Having gone through the server code line by line, next we'll go through the implementation of our client program line by line in similar details. Alright, so let's get started with the program in our client.c file. Once again, we have a bunch of header files included at the beginning of this program. Now most of these header files are the same as that were included in the server program as well, so we are not going to go through them again. There is one addition here though, which is this header file netdb.h. This header file defines the structure host ent. We'll be using this structure later in the program. Just as we had defined an error function in the server program, we have this error function here in the client program as well. Again, this function would be called if a system call fails. It will simply display the message about the error on the screen and then simply abort the program. As you can see, a lot of this is similar to what we have already seen in the server program. Next, inside the main function, we have first declared a few integers. So we have this socket file descriptor sockfd, port number, and the integer variable n. The sockfd is once again going to keep the return value from the socket system call, which would be the socket file descriptor. Port number variable is used for storing the port number of the server to which we want to connect, and this variable n is once again going to be used for storing the return value from the read and write system calls. Next, this variable server underscore address of type struct sock address underscore in, this will be used for storing the IP address and the port number of the server to which we want to connect. And finally, this variable server, this is a pointer to a structure of type host ent. This structure is defined in the header file netdb.h. Note that we are using this host ent structure to store information about the server machine which we want to connect to. The host ent structure defines a host computer on the internet, and it stores a bunch of information about that host or that server machine. Now here is a summary of all the information that is stored or contained in the host ent structure. So the first thing the structure contains is the official name of the host or the server machine. Now it is possible that the host has multiple names. If that is true, then this second list h_aliases, this list contains the list of names for the host. So this is essentially a zero terminated list of alternate names for the host. Now the third piece of information here is what is the kind of address that is being returned for this particular server machine or this host. Recall, for internet addresses, this value would always be af_inet. So this information is contained in h_address type field of the structure. Likewise, the official name of the host would be contained in h_name field, and the list of alternate names for the given machine would be contained in h_aliases, this field, particular field of the structure. The fourth piece of information we have here is h_length field. So this is basically the size or length of the machine address in bytes. So this is basically the server machine's address, the length of the server's address in terms of bytes. Note that it is possible that the server machine or the host that we want to connect with has multiple network interfaces, and therefore it may have multiple IP addresses. Therefore, we have this fifth field in the structure called h_address_list, which is a pointer to a list of network addresses for the host or for the server machine. Remember that the host addresses are always returned in network byte order. And finally, for backward compatibility purposes, h_address is an alias defined to the first address contained in this h_address_list. So basically this h underscore address is defined in the structure something like hash define h underscore addr, and we have this h underscore addr underscore list 0, right? So this is the first address contained in this list of network addresses for the server machine or the host. Let us continue with the client code. A lot of the code shown over here is very similar to what we have seen in the server code. So once again, we have defined a character buffer of size 256 bytes for sending and receiving messages to the server machine. This if statement over here ensures that when the user starts or executes the client program, the user must pass the host name or the IP address and the port number. At least these two pieces of information is needed. So the first is basically the host name or the IP address of the server to which this client wants to connect, and the second is the port number of the server machine where the server is listening for connections. Note that this is not the port number for the client. This is the port number where the server is listening for connections. If these two necessary pieces of information are not supplied as the command line arguments, then we'll print an error message and simply terminate the program. After this, here we are using again the A to I function to extract the port number which was supplied as a string in the command line argument to the port number integer variable. So we are converting this ASCII string to integer port number. After that, we are using the socket system call to create a socket for the client process. Again, we have passed the three required parameters. The first parameter is the address domain. Recall for internet domain, we use AF underscore INET symbolic address or symbolic constant. The second here is the kind of sockets to use. Recall there were two choices here, stream sockets and datagram sockets. So here in this example, we are using stream sockets which are specified using sock underscore stream symbolic constant. And finally, recall the third argument was the protocol that we want to use for this socket. 0 means that will allow the operating system to choose the most suitable protocol for the specified socket type. So recall once again, for the stream sockets, the operating system will choose TCP protocol. If the socket system call succeeds, this will return a small integer which would be the file descriptor for this socket. We'll store this file descriptor in the sockfd variable declared earlier. If however for some reason the socket system call fails, then it will return a negative value. So in the subsequent if statement over here, we are comparing the socket, the return value from the socket system call. If it is negative, then we'll print the error message that there was some error in opening the socket and terminate the program. So as you would recall, all of this logic is very similar to what we have already discussed in details while discussing the server code. Recall the first argument that was passed as command line argument to the client code was the name of the server machine, right? So the name of the host or the server to which we want to connect. So for instance, this could be cs1.seattleu.edu if you want to connect to the CS1 server. We can use this host name to connect to the server. However, to make this connection, we first need to extract the IP address of the server from its host name. And to do that, to figure out the IP address of the server or the host by its name, we will use the guest host by name function. This function takes the name of the server machine as an argument and returns a pointer to a host ENT structure containing all the information about the server machine or the host. Recall this server variable is defined as a host ENT structure type earlier in our program. If for some reason the get host by name function returns a null value, it means the host or the system that we are looking for could not be located or could not be found. And therefore we'll print an appropriate error message and simply terminate the program. However, if the host was in fact found, then recall the field character pointer h underscore address inside this structure would contain the IP address of the host or the server machine that we want to connect with. Next, in this code, we will set the fields in the server underscore address structure before we attempt to connect with the server. Now, much of this code over here is similar to what we have also seen in the server. So just as we have done previously, we are first using this b0 function to initialize the server underscore address variable with all zeros. Recall, this is a structure of type sock address underscore in. Next, we copy the IP address and the port number of the server machine into this server underscore address structure. Recall, this server underscore address, this structure sock address underscore in, this has 4 fields. Out of these 4, we only need to set 3. One is a character string, which is basically as a convention set to zeros or left to be zeros. The first of the other 3 fields is the address family for this server address, which for internet addresses is set to af underscore inet. Next, we need to copy the IP address of the server into this field server underscore address dot sin underscore address dot s underscore address. Recall, the IP address of the server machine was returned by get host by name function as a host ent structure type, which was stored in this server variable. We saw this on the previous slide. Further recall, the IP address of the host or the server machine is stored in h underscore address field of host ent structure, and this field is a character string. You would recall this from the previous slide. Since this h underscore address is a character string, we will use the bcopy function to copy the IP address into the corresponding field of our server underscore address structure instance. Recall, the prototype of the bcopy function looks like this. We have void bcopy and character string s1 comma character string s2 comma integer length. So essentially, this bcopy function copies length number of bytes from string s1 to string s2. So that is what we are doing here in the bcopy function. The first parameter here is the source string. The second parameter is the destination string, which is basically the IP address field of our server underscore address field. And recall, the h underscore length field of host ent object, which is server host ent structure, which is this server variable here. This contains the size or length of the IP address or the address of the host. Finally, we store the port number of the server in the sin port field of server underscore address object. Server underscore address structure instance. And once again, before copying this port number, the server port number, which was passed as a command line argument, before we copy this into the server underscore address structure, we are using this htons function to convert it into network byte order. Subsequently, we use the connect function call to establish a connection to the server machine. This connect call takes 3 arguments. The first parameter here is the socket file descriptor. Recall, this was the file descriptor returned by the socket call. Next is the address of the server machine or the host to which we want to connect. Recall, both the IP address and the port numbers of the server are stored in the server underscore address variable. And the third argument here is simply the size of the server underscore address structure instance. If the connect function call succeeds, then it will return a 0. Otherwise, it will return a -1 or a negative value on failure. So that is what we are using here in the if statement to check for the success of this connect call. If for some reason it returns a negative value, then we'll call our error function, print the error message, and terminate the program. At this point, before moving forward, it is important for us to realize that the client program only needs to know the port number of the server machine. It does not need to know its own port number. The client's port number would typically be assigned by the system when the connect function is called. Now these facts are summarized over here as well. These are the last several lines of the client code. Most of these are self-explanatory, and or we have already talked about these earlier in the server code. So I'll quickly go through these. The client program first here prints a message asking the user to enter a message string. Using this B0 function, the client will initialize the buffer with all zeros. Recall we have earlier declared a buffer that can store up to 256 characters. Next, the client program uses fgetters function to read the message entered by the user from the standard input. Then the client program will send this message string to the server using the write function call. Recall there are three parameters to the write function call. First is the socket file descriptor, the socket on which we want to send the message. Now for the client, this is the socket that was returned by the socket function call. Recall in the server program, when we used the write function call, we used the socket file descriptor that was returned by the accept system call, not by the socket system call. But that is different here. At the client, we will use the socket that was returned by the socket function call. The second parameter to the write function call is the buffer, which contains the message that we want to send, and the third parameter is simply the length of this buffer. Once again, this write function call will return the number of bytes or characters that were successfully sent or written in the socket, which is usually a positive integer. Now if for some reason there was an error writing on the socket, then the return value of this write function call would be negative, and if that happens, we will print an error message and terminate the program. Assuming there was no error, the message was sent successfully over the socket. So now recall from our demo, the client will wait for an acknowledgement from the server machine. So to receive that acknowledgement, again we use this B0 function to clear out the buffer, and then we make this read function call to read the acknowledgement from the server on the socket. Recall this read is a blocking call, so it will block the client until there is something to read on the socket. Again, there are three parameters here. The first is socket file descriptor for the socket on which we are reading the message. The second is the buffer into which we want to read the message, and third is the maximum size of message that we can read. Now because the size of our buffer is 256, the size of message that we read from the socket cannot be greater than 256. Here it is 255. Once again, if the read is successful, it will return the number of characters or bytes that were successfully read from the socket. If there was an error in reading from the socket, the read will return a negative value. If that happens, then once again we will print the error message on the screen and terminate the program. If not, if everything goes smoothly, we'll simply print the content of the buffer, which will contain the message or acknowledgement received from the server, and then this return 0 will terminate the main program and the client itself. So we have gone through the implementation for both the client and the server programs, and so far in our examples we have been using the generic read and write calls for receiving and sending messages on sockets. However, in addition to the read and write functions, send and receive can also be used for sending and receiving messages on sockets. So let's quickly walk through these two functions one by one. As the name implies, the send function is used for sending data over a socket. As you can see here, the send function has a lot of similarities to the write function that we talked about earlier. So let's go to the parameters here and the similarities will become clear. So the first parameter which is passed to the send function is the socket to which we want to send data. Now this socket must already be in the connected state, and here we are assuming that the other function calls that need to be made for creating and establishing a socket or initializing a socket, they have all been done. So this is the file descriptor of the socket to which we want to send the data. Recall the first parameter in the write function call was also the socket. The second parameter here is a pointer to the data that we want to send. Now note that here it is a void pointer, but this could also be simply a character buffer containing the message we want to send. All we need to do is we need to cast the buffer, the character buffer, into the void pointer. The third parameter here is the length or size of the message that we want to send. So this is essentially the number of bytes we are sending in this message, which we can get simply by doing a size of message. Recall the third parameter passed to the write function call was also the size of the message. And finally, we have the flags parameter that can be used for setting various options. Note that the only difference between the send function and the write function is the presence of this flags parameter. If you don't want to specify any special options, you can simply specify 0 for the flags. If you do that with a flag argument of 0, send is essentially the same as the write function call. To give you an example of the kind of options that can be set using these flags, one possible option would be, let's say you want to ignore the receipt of certain signals. You can specify that with the help of flags. So for instance, let's say you want to ignore the sig pipe signal. You can set this flag msg underscore no signal to ignore the sig pipe signal in your socket. Now you might wonder, how is this useful? Why should we be ignoring this signal? Consider this example scenario. Let's say your server program is communicating with a client program on another machine, and for some reason the client on the other machine crashes. Maybe the machine went down or something went wrong. So the client on the other end has crashed, and so the socket on the other end is no longer available. Let's say it is closed. However, your server program doesn't know about this. So the server will, let's say it attempts to send a message to the socket which has been closed by the remote end. If you do this, the server program will receive this sig pipe signal. Now by default, the handler of the sig pipe signal will terminate the server program as well. Therefore, on a multi-threaded server, to prevent the server from crashing as a result of client closing the socket abruptly, the correct action is to ignore the sig pipe signal and handle it differently. So that is just a simple example of what you can achieve using these flags. If the send function call succeeds, it will return the number of bytes that were sent successfully on the socket. Note that you should check whether the number of bytes that are returned by the send function matches the third parameter you passed, this message length, in your send function. If for some reason the send function call fails, it will return a -1. Now quickly note that the return type of the send function is size underscore t, right? So recall this is a signed size type. Simply put, you can think of size underscore t as an alias for a 16-bit signed integer. However, this data type is used specifically for representing sizes of objects in memory. Here is a simple example illustrating the use of the send function. For this example, for simplicity, we are assuming that we want to send a fixed size 50 byte string. So in our program, we have declared a string variable, and this is a character buffer that can store up to 50 characters. Then we are requesting the user to enter our 50 byte string in this string variable. Next, we check if the user entered a string which has more than 50 characters, then this string is too long for us, because note that our character buffer can only hold strings up to 50 characters. So in this case, we'll terminate the program. Let's assume there is no such error and the string is of the expected size. Next, we copy the string entered by the user into our character buffer using the strcpy function. Note that this is the destination and this is the source. Note that this msg_str, this message string, is a string data type, and that is why we are using this c_str function. In the strcpy function, we basically need a character pointer to the null terminated sequence of characters, and that is why we have this c_string function. Recall, c_string str function returns a pointer to an array that contains a null terminated sequence of characters representing the current value of the string object. So once we have copied the content of the message string into our message buffer, we can use this buffer to send it over socket. So here we are using the send function call to send this message string or this character message now in the message buffer to the socket. So the first parameter to this send function call is the socket. We are assuming that this socket was initialized and created earlier using the appropriate function calls or system calls. The second parameter, recall, is the message that we want to send. So the message is now copied in this message character string or character buffer, but again recall that the second parameter in the send function is basically a void pointer, and that is why we are casting this array of characters into a void pointer. The third parameter here, recall, is the size of the message. In this example, since we are assuming that we are sending a fixed 50 byte string, we have specified this as 50. And the last parameter, recall, is the flags. We have indicated the flags to be 0, which means we are not specifying any special options here. On success, recall, the send function returns the number of bytes that were sent successfully to the socket. So finally, we will check that the number of bytes that were sent, whether they are equal to 50, which was our original plan, the original message size, if they are equal or not, right? So if bytes sent is not equal to 50 in this case, this means there was some error in sending the message. The complete message was not sent, and so we will terminate the program. Now note that this is a very simple example, and that's why if the number of bytes that were sent is not equal to 50, we terminate the program. But you don't necessarily need to terminate the program. Let's say you wanted to send 50 bytes. Out of 50, in the first attempt, you could only send, let's say, 30 bytes. So the remaining 20 bytes you can send in the next attempt. So you can keep trying until all the 50 bytes are sent. So essentially, you can keep calling the send function until all the 50 bytes are sent across. Next, let us talk about the receive function. As the name implies, the receive function is used for receiving data from the socket. The receive function also takes 4 parameters. The first parameter here is the socket file descriptor. So this is the socket from which we want to receive the data. Note that the socket must be in a connected state for receiving any data. The second parameter here is the buffer. Note that the data that we receive from the network would be stored here in this buffer. The third parameter here is the buffer length, which is typically the size of this buffer. The buffer length basically indicates the maximum number of bytes that we can receive. And once again, the final option, the fourth option here is the flags. The fourth parameter is the flags. Like we have seen earlier, the flags can be used for setting various special options. If you don't want to specify any special options, you can simply pass a 0 for the flags. Just like the send function, the return type of receive function is also size_t, signed size type. If this receive function call succeeds, it returns the number of bytes that were successfully received from the socket. This receive function call will return a 0 if there is nothing else left to receive from the socket and the sender has properly shut down. Otherwise, if there was an error in receiving the message, the receive function call will return a -1. It is important to realize when we are reading messages from the socket or receiving messages on the socket, due to networking issues, we may not receive all of our data with a single call to receive or read functions. So for instance, let's say we are expecting to receive 3000 bytes of data from a sender, and sender has sent all of these 3000 bytes of data in a single chunk. However, still it is possible that in the network, when this 3000 bytes of data was traveling from the sender to the receiver, it got fragmented. So it is possible that this 3000 bytes of data got fragmented into 3 chunks of 1000 bytes each. So when you make a call to receive function, you may not receive the entire 3000 bytes that you are expecting to. You may receive it in chunks of 1000 bytes over 3 iterations. And therefore, while receiving messages, it is a good idea to create a loop that will eventually collect all of the expected data. Now note that here we are working under the assumption that we know precisely what is the size of the data that was sent by the sender. So in our example here we are assuming, let's say it is 3000 bytes. Now later we'll talk briefly how the communication can work if we don't know the precise size of the data. But for now, let's assume that we do know the precise size. I should point out this issue of fragmentation of messages in the network. Although theoretically it can happen with messages of any size, in practice, usually you would not find this issue for messages that are small, for example, few bytes. Nevertheless, it could still happen sometimes, and therefore creating a loop to collect all of the expected data is a good idea. Having said that about receiving the messages, note that there is buffering on the operating system side, and therefore doing this above exercise is not necessary for sending the messages. Let's take an example to understand how we can use the receive function call in a loop to collect all the bytes in an incoming message. For the sake of this example, let us assume that the message size is 15 bytes. So initially, the total number of bytes that are left to receive at the beginning is 15. So we will initialize, we will declare a variable integer, let's say bytes left, and this will be initialized to 15. So this variable will keep track of how many bytes are left to be retrieved from the socket. Next, let us declare a character buffer, and this buffer should have enough space to receive all of the incoming bytes. So let's make it size 15. Initially, this character buffer would be empty. After this, we define or declare a character pointer, BP. Now this character pointer will always point to the next empty spot in the buffer. So the next spot where we can write an incoming byte. Initially, this character pointer will point to the beginning of the buffer. Having declared all the variables, we can now start collecting or retrieving the message on the socket inside a while loop. So while we have bytes left to receive, so as long as bytes left is not 0, this loop will continue. So let's use the receive call to receive message from the socket. Recall the first parameter to the receive call is the socket. So let's assume that this socket, this file descriptor sock was initialized earlier. Recall the second parameter is a void pointer to the buffer where we want to receive the incoming message. So we will receive it in this buffer that we have declared. So here in the second parameter, we'll pass the character pointer BP, which is initially pointing to the beginning of the buffer, and we are typecasting it to void pointer. Recall the third parameter in receive is the maximum number of bytes that we can receive. So that would be basically bytes left. Initially the bytes left would be 15, but as this while loop iterates a few times, this will decrease. and as it decreases, it will indicate the leftover capacity in the buffer. And the last parameter is the flags. For our purposes here, we don't want to set any special options, so let's set the flags to 0. Recall, on successful execution, the receive function returns the number of bytes that were read from the socket. Therefore, to keep track of the number of bytes that have already been read from the socket and the number of bytes that are left, we will store the return value of receive in another integer. So let's declare another integer, bytes received. This is where we will store the return value from the receive function. Now, in the worst case, it is possible that there was some error in this reception. Recall, if there is an error, the receive function call returns -1, right? So we should first check if this return value, bytes received, is less than equal to 0. This indicates an error, and therefore we can exit the program. You can also print an error message. However, if there is no error, then we have received some bytes. So we should now update the number of bytes that are left to be received after this iteration. And so we do bytes left is equal to bytes left minus bytes received. Note that these number of bytes, the bytes received number of bytes, have been received from the socket, and they would be written in the buffer. And therefore, before the next iteration of the while loop, we need to update the position to which this character pointer is pointing, so that it is pointing now to the next available location in the buffer. So to do that, we simply say BP, this pointer is equal to BP, the current location of the pointer, plus bytes received. So we advance the pointer by these number of bytes, and that ends the while loop. To help you visualize the execution of the program, let's assume that this is our buffer that has space for storing 15 bytes. So the beginning of this buffer is basically here. This is the 0th element of the buffer. Initially, when the program begins execution, the character pointer BP would be pointing to the 0th element of the buffer. Let's assume that in the first iteration of the while loop, 3 characters are received, let's say A, B and C. So this receive function call will place these 3 characters A, B and C inside this buffer, starting from the position indicated by this buffer pointer. So which is basically currently pointing to location 0. So A, B and C would be placed here. After storing the characters, assuming there is no error here, we will update this bytes left. So note that initially the bytes left was 15. Now 3 bytes have been received, so bytes left would be 12. And then we will update the point at which this buffer pointer is pointing, right? So here when we do BP is equal to BP plus byte received, our buffer pointer will become 0, which was the current value of the buffer pointer, plus 3, which is the number of bytes received. So the buffer pointer will now start pointing to the 3rd location in this buffer. And note that this 3rd location is now the immediate next empty location in the buffer, which is available for storing the new incoming bytes. And so in the next iteration, let's say 3 more bytes are received, D, E and F, they would be written in the buffer starting here, the next empty location 3. They will not overwrite the previously written bytes in the buffer. The example code is also summarized over here. Once the communication is done, we use the close function call for closing the socket. Once the socket is closed, it can no longer be used to send or receive messages. To close the socket, we simply need to pass the socket file descriptor as a parameter to the close function. If the close call succeeds, it returns a value of 0 on success. If it fails, or if there is an error, a -1 is returned by the close function. Having gone over implementation of a TCP client and a TCP server, let us now look at how we can send and receive various different types of data items over the network. Recall, earlier in the unit we have seen that different machines can store integers in different orders inside their memories. So for instance, let's assume that this is our 2-byte short integer. Let us further assume that these are bits number 0 to 7, and then we have bits number 8 to 15 over here. So this is our least significant byte and this is our most significant byte in the integer. For illustration, let us further assume that the bit pattern that is contained in this 2-byte integer is hexadecimal AB in the most significant byte and hexadecimal CB in the least significant byte. Now let's further assume that this is the RAM or the main memory inside a computer. And let's say these are addresses 0, 1, 2, 3 and so forth. Let's assume that each of the cells here in the RAM represents 1 byte. Now there are two possible ways of storing this integer in the computer's memory. So one possible way is we first store the most significant byte followed by the least significant byte. So essentially we store the most significant byte AB in the lower memory address followed by the least significant byte CB in the higher memory address. In other words, we first store the big end, the most significant end of this integer in the memory followed by the smaller end. If we do this, this is known as the big endian order of storing integers, because we are first storing the most significant byte in the memory. As opposed to this, the other possibility is that we first store the least significant byte followed by the most significant byte in the memory. So for example, we could first store the least significant byte CD in the smaller memory address followed by the most significant byte of the integer AB in the higher memory address. If this is what we are doing, if this is how we are storing integers in the computer's memory, we are using what is known as the little endian format, since we are storing the least significant byte first. The problem is some machines store integers using the big endian format while others store integers using the little endian format. And therefore, there could be confusions and problems if we are trying to send an integer from a big endian machine to a little endian machine or vice versa. And therefore, to address this issue, a network byte order has been defined, which happens to be the big endian format. So recall, in the big endian format, we first store the most significant byte followed by the least significant byte. All the integers should be converted into the network byte order before sending across the network, and all the integers must be converted back into the host byte order before they are used at the receiving end. Fortunately, there are predefined and pre-implemented functions that we can use to convert integers from host byte order to network byte order and vice versa. So if you want to convert a 32-bit integer from the host byte order to the network byte order, you can simply use this function h2nl, which essentially stands for host to network long. So this h is the host. From the host byte order we want to convert to the network byte order, and this L over here, this stands for long. So note that 32-bit integer is considered as long. The function will accept the 32-bit integer in the host byte order and it will return the same integer in the network byte order. Similarly, if you want to convert the 16-bit integer from the host byte order to the network byte order, you can use this function host to network short. So again, this H is it stands for host, and we want to convert this short from host byte order to the network byte order. N is for network and S stands for the short integer. So it only converts short integers. As a parameter, it will accept the 16-bit integer in the host byte order and it will return the equivalent integer in network byte order. Likewise, if you want to do the other way conversion, let's say you want to convert a 32-bit integer from the network byte order to the host byte order, then you can use this N2HL function. So this is network to host long. This function will accept a 32-bit integer in network byte format and will return the same integer in the host byte format. And finally, to convert a 16-bit integer from the network byte order to the host byte order, you can use this function N2HS. This function will accept a 16-bit integer in network byte order and return the equivalent integer in host machine's byte order. This example code over here illustrates how we can properly send an integer over the network. Let's say we want to transmit this host integer over the network. So here we have declared the host integer, and then we ask the user to enter some value to be stored in this host int. Now note that this host integer would by default be in the host's byte order. Now the host byte order may be little endian or it could be big endian. We don't know. Unfortunately, we don't really need to know. Regardless of the byte ordering used by the host machine, we can use the host to network long function for converting this host integer into network byte order. And in this example, we are storing the network byte order for the host integer in this other variable network int. Note that if this host integer was already in network byte order, because the machine happens to use the same byte order as the network's byte order, then this host to network long function will simply return the integer as it is. However, if the host integer is in a different byte order, then this function will convert the host integer into appropriate network byte order. And therefore, in either case, we can use this host to network long to be sure that the integer which we will be sending over the network is in the network byte order. Now this integer, network int, which was returned by host to network long function, is the one that we will send using the send function call. So now we can use the send function to send across the integer. The first parameter here in the send recall is the socket in which we want to send the message. So this is the socket file descriptor. The second parameter recall is the message that we want to send, and so here we are sending the address of this network int, and we are typecasting it to void pointer because recall, the second parameter in the send function, is a void pointer. The third parameter recall is the size of the message. So in this case, it is simply the size of the long that we are sending. And once again, we have set the fourth parameter, which is the flags, as 0 as a default option because we are not setting any special options here. The return value of the send function will tell us how many bytes were transmitted or sent. So we compare, finally, we compare whether the number of bytes that were sent is the same as the size of long integer which we were intending to send. If these two are the same, then no problem, the integer has been sent. If not, if there is a difference between the number of bytes that were actually sent and the size of the long, then there has been an error in sending, so we abort the program. Note that these kinds of errors are quite unlikely while sending the messages. This sample code over here illustrates how we can receive an integer from the network. Again, we will be making several calls to the receive function inside a while loop until all the expected bytes of an integer have been received. This logic is very similar to what we have already seen in one of the previous examples. Recall, where we were receiving a message by iteratively calling the receive function several times inside a while loop. The main difference here is instead of retrieving a character string, we are retrieving an integer from the network. So first we have initialized the variable bytes left, which keeps track of the number of bytes that are remaining to be received from the socket. So this is initially initialized to size of long, which is usually 4 bytes, since we are retrieving a long integer. Next, we have declared a variable long network int. This is where we will store the integer as it is received from the network or from the socket. Next, we have declared this character pointer BP, and it has been initialized to point to the beginning of the address of network int. So let's assume this is our network int, and let's say it has these 4 bytes. So this character pointer BP will point to the beginning, the 0th byte of this network int initially. The logic inside this while loop is almost identical to what we have already seen in the previous example. We'll keep iterating in this while loop until there are more bytes left to be retrieved for this long integer. In the receive function call, we pass the socket from where we are receiving the integer. The second parameter is the character pointer BP, which is the pointer to the beginning of the network int buffer. This is where we want to store the retrieved integer or long. The third parameter recall is the maximum number of bytes that can be received, so which initially would basically be the size of integer or long. And finally again the flags is set to default 0. The return value of the receive function will be stored in this integer bytes received. If the number of bytes received is less than or equal to 0, essentially this is negative, then there is an error in receiving the message, will terminate the program. If bytes received are greater than 0, then we have received some part of the integer at least. So now we will update the number of bytes left as bytes left minus bytes received, and we'll advance this buffer pointer to the next available spot inside our buffer network int by adding bytes received to its current value. Finally, when the bytes left reaches 0, we have retrieved the entire integer from the network and it is now stored inside this network int. Now recall, when this this integer is retrieved from the network, it would be in the network byte order. So before we can start using it on the local machine, we need to convert it from the network byte order to the local host byte order. To do that, we use this network to host long function, and the host byte order format for the retrieved integer would be saved in this long host int. And this host int can now be used for operations in the local machine. Here is a quick summary of how you can transmit some other data types over the network. Now, transmitting 1 byte ASCII characters is straightforward. There is no ordering to worry about because there is only 1 byte to transfer. However, if you want to transfer 2 byte Unicode characters, then ordering could be an issue. No standard endian format has been defined for the floating point values, and hence you need to be cautious when you are transferring floating points. One possible way of transmitting the floating point values could be to break them up into bytes, for example into a character buffer, and send each of these bytes separately. Transmitting pointers usually doesn't make sense because the address stored inside a pointer is a memory address in the local machine. So what could the receiver anyway do with the memory address of some variable on the sender's machine? To transmit arrays, you can send each element stored in the array independently. So for instance, if you have an integer array, you can send each of the integers stored in the array one by one inside a loop. Another thing that you need to be aware of when transmitting and receiving arrays is the size of the array. If the receiver knows the size of the array, it will know how many elements to expect. If the size of the array is not known, then you may need to define a delimiter that marks the end of the array. We can also transmit structs over the network. These are good for sending collections of data. However, there are several caveats that we need to consider while doing this. So first of all, if there are any integers inside the struct, those need to be converted into network byte order. Second, the struct should not contain any pointers. Like we have seen, sending pointers from one machine to the other machine doesn't really make sense. Now the third thing here is we need to be aware of the alignment and padding issues. In general, we can never be sure that the structure padding which is used by the sending machine will be the same as the structure padding used by the receiving machine. Now, one possible way of working around this problem would be to split our structure down to its basic types. Then serialize each of those values into a byte array using network byte ordering. And then finally, we can transmit this byte array or the buffer. Now on the receiving end, the receiver must be able to reconstruct the original struct from these bytes in the buffer. to facilitate the reconstruction of the structure on the other side, we may need to include some extra information. So for example, maybe a byte to indicate which structure is being sent, and maybe some other bytes to give the length of the data being sent and so forth. Finally, if you want to send collections of data, instead of trying to send classes, use structs. Recall, we have talked about TCP client and server implementation. So essentially, the client and server programs we have discussed, they use the TCP protocol for communication. It is important to understand some of the features of this TCP protocol in order to make the communication work. You should realize that TCP is a byte stream protocol. What that means is the TCP protocol views messages as a stream of bytes. There is no notion of message boundaries in TCP. And therefore, it is possible that just a single call to the receive function or to the read function on the socket may retrieve data from more than one messages, unless only one message was sent by the sender. So for instance, let's say we have a sender and a receiver. Let's assume the sender makes two consecutive calls to the send function. With the first call, sender sends message M1, and so let's say this is our message M1, and let's say with the second call to send, sender sends this message chunk M2. Now on the receiver end, when let's say we only make one call to receive, and it is possible that with this just one call to receive, let's say we retrieve entire message M1 and then we also retrieve some portion of message M2. This is possible because, like we have seen, TCP has no notion of message boundaries. Now, although this is possible in theory, in practice, however, often it is the case that only one message is sent at a time. So rarely there are two or more messages sent back to back. Nevertheless, you should keep this possibility in mind. Note that the receive function does not return any end of message code. It is the programmer's responsibility to check when the message has fully arrived. So the question is, how do we check whether the message has fully arrived? Now there are multiple possibilities here. The first possibility is, let's say the size of the message that was sent is fixed and we know the size. So for example, let's say we know that the sender sent exactly 30 bytes. So in this case, we can direct the receive function to receive exactly 30 bytes of data from the socket. Recall from our previous examples in this lecture, we may have to call this receive inside a loop, because a single call to the receive function may not retrieve the entire message in just one call. So you should call this receive inside a loop, even though you know the size of the message exactly. The second possibility here is that the size of the message sent by the sender is not known exactly in advance. It is variable. So maybe, for example, the sender is sending strings which may be of variable length. So in this case, to reliably retrieve the entire message, it is necessary to send some additional information so that the receiver knows when exactly the message has completely arrived or when the message ends. Here are some things that can be done to detect the end of a variable message. The first thing we can do is, the end of the message can be marked by using some special delimiter character. Whenever the receiver encounters this special delimiter, the receiver will know that the message has completely arrived. Now here a few things here. First of all, the delimiter which is being used to mark the end of the message should not appear as part of the message, otherwise it will confuse the receiver. So for instance, if we are sending ASCII characters, the null character can be used as a delimiter, right? So this is our null character. This is a possible candidate as a delimiter. There could be other candidates. Now the good thing about this approach is it is straightforward, simple, but the slight downside here is it may appear slow, especially because we have to inspect every byte looking for the delimiter. Nevertheless, it is not as slow as you might think. mainly because of buffering and other performance optimizations that are done by the operating system. Also note that we don't have to receive one byte at a time. We can read, let's say, n number of characters together at the same time and then look for the delimiter in the received characters at the end. Using delimiters to mark the end of a variable length message is one way. Another possibility is to explicitly send the length of the message before sending the actual variable length message. So for instance, let's say a sender wants to send a string and this string can be of variable size. So every time before sending the actual string, the sender can send an integer variable containing the length of the string that is to follow. So the receiver will always first receive an integer which will inform what is the length of the string to follow. Note that receiving an integer is not a problem for the receiver because size of the integer is known, it is fixed. Once the receiver knows the size of the string, the receiver can allocate a buffer of precise size to store the contents of the incoming variable length message or variable length string in this case.